I am Nail Egyptian, and I'm the owner of the Nail Egyptian Press-On Collection, and I'm originally from Compton, California. I started doing nails in high school, but I started doing press-on nails when I traveled to Ghana for the first time in 2013, which inspired me to make the Nail Egyptian Press-On Collection. The style and design behind every nail set is inspired by the queens and goddesses of ancient Africa. I love when my customers tell me they feel inspired and empowered when they wear the nails, and it makes me feel happy that I'm able to connect with people in my community and make them feel beautiful. Visit my website at nakedgoldonline.com. Welcome everyone, welcome to an episode of Griot of the Diaspora. I am NAKIRA G, and today we're going to talk about what happened on social media with Tyla. Apparently, people are in an uproar because she identifies as colored, which is an ethnic group in South Africa, but somehow people have found a way to make a diaspora war out of it. So we're gonna talk about that, and we're gonna break that down a little bit, and we're just gonna show some facts, talk about some history, and this will be a real quick episode. And hopefully you have watched my other episodes and you have an idea of what we talk about here and you enjoy it. So let's get into it. Okay, so Tyla, like many people know, is South African. There are a plethora of identities in South Africa, but most people are not aware of the various identities that exist. So we're gonna talk about that in a second. But I'm gonna start off with what I at least saw was the reason that this conversation even happened. Apparently, I'm gonna assume that there was some interview that happened where Tyla was asked what her ethnicity was and she said colored. And basically people are reacting to that. And when I say people, I'm talking about Black Americans, right? For the record, I am Black, I was born in America, but I also feel different ways about that as well. I identify as Black. I don't necessarily identify as like Black American. That's a whole nother thing. But we're gonna talk about this because this was something I wanted to talk about before, and I'm glad that this actually came up because I think that it's really important that Black Americans have an idea of what goes on outside of America, and I know that that's really difficult. And it's really no shade, like I'm really not trying to come at people crazy. It's like I'm not even really trying to be funny. It's just that the way that y'all be tweeting on Twitter, it really make me feel like y'all ain't been outside. You know, depending on where you live, there might be, you know, certain demographics and certain ethnic groups that are more popular than others. Obviously, there are a lot of South Africans that live in America, but in comparison to the Nigerian population or the Middle Eastern population, I would kind of assume that the South African population in America is quite small, right? And so I think that we often see these conversations on Black Twitter where, you know, African Twitter or whatever the specific country is, their side might be talking about something, and it is very common for Black American social media users to be very angry or to be in uproar or to have these very strong disagreements about things that you can't necessarily fundamentally disagree about, right? Because, for instance, with this situation, so let's talk about how it started, right? So there's some tweets that I found. I think that there were tweets before this, but there were some tweets that I found of someone named Fuchi on Twitter. I think he's a stylist. He's verified. I'm pretty sure people might know him, but he has a tweet that says, "I don't know, calling people colored just don't sit right with me. Blame slavery." And he also said, "Y'all can do that in South Africa all you want, but we are not doing that here. Not even sorry." Right? And so then someone named Shaheem on Twitter, which is also a very popular Twitter account, and I believe that this person is also a non-binary therapist. They're also Black. Fuchi is also a Black man as well. But Shaheem tweeted, "I'm not disregarding her identity. I've acknowledged multiple times that she is non-Black. I am not using a slur to describe anyone because that phrase is traumatizing. not for me, but for my entire community. I don't have to refer to her as that to acknowledge her identity. So I guess those tweets, as well as the threads that were created after, there were, I feel like each person that spoke on this topic, they pretty much created a thread for it. And but those two were the ones that stuck out to me because I feel like those were the ones that I noticed people responding to. And these two, Fuchi and Shaheen, from my understanding, they are Black American. Obviously, they pretty much kind of make that clear if you read between the lines. And they are basically saying that they acknowledge that Tyla is not Black, but they don't feel comfortable calling her colored, right? That's pretty much what this conversation is about, right? And I know for a lot of us in America, we have a history with the word colored, right? And we have a history with every word that has been used to describe us, right? And majority of the time, the issue with those words are that they are words we didn't get to choose, right? And they were words that were put into law and we were forced to identify with, and there was no backing to it, right? I think for me, what I've learned in the 10 years that I have studied Africana studies, African studies, as well as the 10 years that I have lived on and off in Ghana, I will say that the Black American experience to being Black is simply, specifically our experience. You know, our Black experience is not the same experience as people in the Caribbean and in South America and on the African continent or in Asia. You know, I think that because in America we had a very specific experience with the word colored, and we had Jim Crow, and we had segregation, and before all of that we had slavery. I think that what makes it uncomfortable for Black Americans is because we were taken from whichever land, territory in Africa, and we were brought somewhere else, right? And there is a different experience for the people who are born on the African continent, and whether they have a connection to slavery or not, they still are on the continent. So their perspective of the history of slavery is going to be different naturally. And I think that a lot of times Black Americans, we assume that we are not just the center of history, but I think that we forget that every year that something was going on in America as early as 1492 or 1212, you know, there were still things going on these other lands and these other territories. And I think sometimes because of the way that our history is taught to us very centralized, and it's very washed out of the truth of different experiences. We don't naturally just learn about what was going on in Jamaica, or what was going on in Brazil, or what was going on in the Congo. Like, those are not things that are just naturally told to us. And I noticed that when it comes to specifically this issue, where Black Americans on social media, they're basically saying, why do we have to call her colored? Why do we have to call her colored when we have our own history with that? The biggest difference between South Africans having a population that is called colored is that, and this is what I think is the most important kind of part of this whole topic. In America, our mixed population is not a unifying front, right? We are still struggling, well, mixed people are still struggling with the fact that they have to choose if they're Black or if they're white, right? And I noticed that people who are mixed with just Black and white, or Black and Asian, like if they are just if their ethnic background is kind of like just one and one, I noticed that their concept of identity is very different from people who have two biracial parents. And now they have about 4 different things in them, and they were also raised with multicultural practices, right? I think a lot of times, because in America, we have this thing where it's like, if you're one drop of African or one drop of black, then you're black. And in all respect, I think that the one drop rule is not valid anymore, and probably shouldn't have ever been in certain instances, right? I think that it's different when you force a mixed person to say, I'm black and white. It's different when they have a black parent and they have a white parent. That's very easy to say, yeah, I'm black and I'm white, right? But I think it becomes different when you are somebody like a Tyler or people, and people in America have this issue as well, which is why, not issue, but have this identity as well, which I don't understand why it's such a nuanced thing that people aren't understanding, right? Because if you have two biracial parents, like a lot of our celebrities, right, naturally, you know what all cultures you are from, but when it comes to phenotypically what you might look like in comparison to other people, it also brings a sense of awareness where you're now kind of aware that, like, okay, this is my culture, but I might not have the same bloodline or the amount of bloodline to where I look like this person, right? And in the case of Tyler, since that's what we're talking about, if you look at Tyler, she has curly hair, yeah, but for me, curly hair doesn't identify someone as automatically black, right? And I also don't necessarily believe that just because you have African ancestry and you have African bloodlines, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna be raised black or you're gonna be raised African, right? And I think what Black Americans are missing in this moment is that they're on the African continent. So with all due respect, anybody that's born on the African continent can pretty much say that they're African. Like, you know, the white people in South Africa, they're considered African, right?
And when I say they're considered African, I mean they're considered African by law, not because everybody agrees with that.
I've seen Mean Girls. That was the joke, right? The joke was that the white girl said she was South African and she identified as African, and she was a white girl with European ancestry and didn't have any African mixing, right? And so I think that people just kind of have this misconception that if you have any African blood, or if your ancestors at 4 generations back was African, then you need to identify as African. And I think that that's very outdated, but also there's space and there is a world where words like biracial and multiracial, or words like colored, actually does include African, right? It actually includes the fact that there was some African bloodline. But we also need to be careful, because if you're like me, at least, I also understand that race isn't real, right? I also understand that the concept of racial phenotypes and features and featureism and all of those things we have just been kind of taught to analyze to understand who has more privilege than us. But in the grand scheme of things, we don't necessarily really care what people are, but because we have political issues like saying the N-word, or people saying that they are black, or people wanting to cross over into black markets and into black spaces and either cosplaying as black, then we have these certain conversations. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't see the problem, right? Now, I think that it is okay. In reality, it is valid for Black Americans to feel the way that they feel. I don't know if it's valid to speak it out loud, and I don't know if it's valid to put fuel to that fire. But I think it is valid to have a natural emotional reaction to that. But I do think that, especially for Black people in America who haven't been on the African continent at all, I think that that does change a lot of things. And this is not to even sound like one of those people that's like, y'all ain't been nowhere. I'm not even really trying to be like that. But when people make these type of statements where it's like, I don't understand it, like there's moments where it's like, ooh, these are issues that is not okay and we need to stand up, right? But I think that we also need to acknowledge that a lot of these African countries are like only 60 years old of independence. You know, a lot of these African countries are just now, in the last 4, 5, 6 presidents have seen African presidents, right? In a place like South Africa and even Ghana, where there was a time where there were white kings and white queens that was ruling, you know, these lands, you know. And so I think sometimes as Black Americans, we can get really uncomfortable because our connection to slavery is very specific. And our fight that we saw, that we witnessed, and that we experienced is very specific. But it's not the universal story. And as much as other cultures and other Black ethnic groups in the diaspora, even though they might sympathize and empathize and learn, it's also valid for them to also center their sentiments. It's important for them to have their own struggle. We don't know. In 20 years, South Africans might be like, we not calling ourselves this no more. We don't know. We went through a period where we were called slaves, we were called chattel, we were called 3/5 of a human, we were called Negroes, niggers, African American, Black, right? We have gone through so many different stages to the point where if you look at your birth certificate and you look at your mom's birth certificate and you look at your grandmother's birth certificate, it might be 3 different identities of Black. I know for me it is, you know, and for most people's parents, their birth certificates say Negro, right? And so I think that we have to be very careful, and we have to, when it comes to the diaspora, we just have to learn more, and we just need to read more, and we just need to engage more, and we need to travel more, honestly, because this concept of identity that we do with people who are light-skinned and people who are mixed, you know, it's starting to become a little embarrassing. Because even to just get off of Tyler, we, you know, in America, there's also, I noticed, like, you'll see it on social media with the female hip-hop artists, you see it with the female actresses. We're still dealing with issues of colorism. We're still dealing with issues of forcing biracial people to identify as Black. We're still forcing Amber Rose to admit what her identity is, and she's spoken about what her identity is, and y'all have seen her parents, and y'all still want this girl to force herself to say that she's Black. And I think even maybe Amber Rose might even be confused, or maybe the way that she has explained it has sounded confusing. But just because she said that her parents are Cape Verdean and they are African, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are Black African. They could be Portuguese African. They could be Middle Eastern African. They could be a mixture of Indian and Asian, and they could be a mixture of different things, but they had generations in Africa, right? And then when you look at certain, you have to look at all of the African countries as its own individual country. You can't apply the same phenotypical history of Nigeria and Ghana and place that in South Africa or Eritrea. Every single African country has a completely different experience. East Africa has the history with the Middle Eastern, right? And in South Africa, they have a history that includes Indians and Asians and different varieties of European they're not tribes to me. I guess European ethnic groups, you know, Dutch and British, right? And so I think that we just sometimes forget that, and we forget that the concept of what we think is black deals mostly with what we look like. We base blackness with our skin complexion, with our facial features, and the reason why is because that's what white scientists did, and that's what scientific racism is. That is what they used to make us feel like we were different from white people. But when you're in Africa and you look at black African people, you realize that every phenotype is here. Every facial feature, every, you know, experience is here. So I really hope that like we get past the colorism issues, the identity issues. I really do hope we get past that, because we need to travel and we need to experience new things as black people in America. Like, we honestly do. We deserve it. We should be experiencing other cultures, because like me, I live in Ghana. I'm here in Ghana. And you know, every day when a Ghanaian speaks to me, they assume that, like just yesterday, a guy asks, "Oh, are you Sudanese?" And I'm like, "No." You know, they asked me if I'm Liberian. They asked me if I'm Nigerian. I've been asked if I was Saudi Arabian. I've been asked if I was South African. I've been asked if I'm every version of an African. But you know what's funny? When I'm in America, y'all will either just see me as a nigga, or a lot of people will assume that I'm mixed, right? Because of certain facial features or my hair or things like that. And a lot of times when people think I'm mixed, it's because of people that I'm around, and they might be mixed or they might be light skinned. And we have this struggle where we compare each other with what we look like, and then we try to identify what people are. And I think that that's very incorrect, and I think that is exactly what scientific racism wants you to do, is pick apart every phenotype and every hair texture. I mean, even the fact that we use hair texture concepts like 1A and 4C, like for what? Like, what exactly are we doing that for, right? And I think that it's really sad that Tyla is experiencing the height of her career, and here goes a group of people trying to discredit her or trying to make it seem like she's cosplaying as black, because to be honest, she's not cosplaying as black. She is being South African, which is what she is. And it is possible to be born in Africa, to identify as African, to have an African passport, and not necessarily be a black African. And that's just the truth. Now, what I will say very quickly, is it possible for colored people in South Africa to be racist or to be anti-black? Yes, that is still possible. Just like how mixed people in America and mixed people all over the world, right, they can still harbor some type of resentment, but that's not everybody, right? But I do think that the more that people try to pick apart what people are and forcing people to identify with things that they don't want to identify with, that is going to start more negativity between groups, and that's going to cause more xenophobia. The more that people keep pushing for people to identify as black or to make it very clear that they're not black, you know, that's going to force people to continue to push themselves away from black and African communities, because why is this even happening? So I think that's really it. That was really what I wanted to say on that. It was something that just kind of popped up on social media, and I just wanted to talk about that, because I thought, you know, this is an issue that we have when we talk about the diaspora and we start talking about colorism and skin tone and blackness and things like that. So hopefully this video will allow people to get their frustrations out, but also realize that, like, your frustrations are, I don't know, like, you know, like, as a black American, I can say, like, you know, the concept of using the word colored, it is triggering. But at the same time, I'm also old enough to know that words can be restructured, and that words can be, and people can take back the power, and that words are not inherently set in stone and they're not cemented, you know. it's okay. You know, I think that it's natural to have that reaction, but it should also be natural to be empathetic and to understand that we're all just here and we're all colonized and we're all oppressed and we're all just trying to figure it out and live day by day. So hopefully this conversation is done by the time I post this video, but something's telling me that it's not. So, all right, y'all, make sure you tune into my next episode. We're gonna keep the conversation going about colorism. So, and I wanna do a few videos this year that's gonna focus on colorism in the media and things like that. So make sure you watch my next episode so we can continue the conversation. And we're gonna talk about colorism and a few different things in concern of recent issues that have happened in Black American media. So we were in South Africa today, but next episode, I think we are going to be in America a bit. So see you guys soon. Thanks for watching.